me see if we're live real quick, and then we'll get started. All right, it looks like everything is working on my end. Let me check YouTube's end. All right, and there we go. Looks like we're live. All right, hello everybody. I am back after a year. I was serving a mission in Guatemala, but I am back now. And one thing I discovered last night, actually, when I was working on another project, was this amazing shader is completely procedural for making TV static. And I know this is something that a lot of people are often looking for when they're making animations for either analog horrors or animations of just like vintage technology, is that old-fashioned crackly static. How many years ago was that? I don't know how many years ago this was, but I posted a few videos on my channel of just recorded TV static, and I actually did it as a test experiment to see if daily uploads led to increased viewer interaction and whatnot. But what I found was it definitely did help, and people love static because one of them is like almost one of the most viewed videos on my channel, which is kind of sad because I put almost zero effort into it, but hey, I'll take it. So when I figured out how to make it entirely procedural within Blender, it got me thinking, well, this needs to be a tutorial. People would love to be able to make this, and it would save a lot of hassle going through and like trying to find that perfect stock footage. What if you could just make it yourself, right? So here's an example right here of, I just had this little 2D screen in space, and so I'll go ahead and hide this and we'll start from scratch, get on with the tutorial. So I'm going to start with the plane and just put it in space so we can see it, and we'll make it like TV sized. Control A to apply the scale just to make sure everything scales correctly when we're doing texturing, and this is going to be our screen. So the next thing we're going to want to do is open up our shader editor, and this is where we're going to do all of the magic. Now some people like to open it up on the side. I open it up on the top. Sometimes I do it on the side, just kind of depends on what other box I'm going to be using. But since this is a fairly simple tutorial, I'm just going to be using shader editor and the viewport. So yeah, we'll hop into textured mode right here so we can see what we're doing. Create a new texture up here, and you can see if we change our base color, right, our little square changes, so we know it's working. Now the key to static, right, you have three parts. You have just like the crackly noise, right, just random dots everywhere, and then you have small lines across the screen, which are normally pretty stable, and then on some static, and I wish I knew more about what exactly caused this, but you have something called scan lines. And scan lines are the lines that you saw moving up the screen slowly. Again, I don't know exactly what causes those, but we're going to work on all three parts separately. And the beautiful part is all of it comes from noise textures. So we'll go ahead and toss a few of those in here. Just look up noise texture. So we got one for the random crackling noise, one for the scan lines, or for the default horizontal lines, whatever you want to call them, and another for the scan lines. All right, so now what we'll do is we will go ahead and plug the color into our base color, and you can see now we have this colorful, just random pattern, and I don't know, it looks like little cotton candy clouds or something like that. What we're going to want to do is we want to make sure that we have Node Wrangler enabled, which you can do just in the basic preferences. It's included with Blender, which is amazing. Control T gives us a texture coordinate and mapping, and this basically tells Blender how to read the information on this square. So what I'm going to do, just set that over here because we're going to be using this a lot for the different parts. And the next part is a color ramp. Now color ramp is used to change the values of this texture right here. In this case, because we have it set on just a scale from black to white, it's just going to give us, it's going to take away all of the color and just make it grayscale. And then obviously if we crank this up, the blacks get darker. If we crank this down, the whites get lighter. And that's kind of how we're going to be adjusting everything. Now next, so the first part, this one right here, is going to be the horizontal lines. I like to start with that one just so I can make sure that everything is working right. So we'll go in here and we'll set this to object. That way we get a more uniform, less horizontally stretched. And you can see it's really small right now. We don't want it to be really small because the horizontal lines are usually pretty big. So we're going to bring our scale down to 1. I think we'll probably crank it down a little bit more, but we'll start with just 1 so you guys can see. Now next, here's our scale, and this is in the mapping node. So we want to make sure that the scale is adjusted on only one axis, and that's going to give us perfectly straight horizontal lines. You can see if I take, for example, the X scale here, and I crank that down, it gets really squashed in one direction. So if I make this 0, you see we now just have perfectly straight vertical lines. If I make the Y 0, now we have no lines at all. That's because it's a two-dimensional plane, so the Z axis doesn't actually exist in this space. So we're going to find the one that gives us horizontal lines, which I believe should be the X. There you go, you can see the horizontal lines forming. And just to make sure it's all good, I like to change the other one to 0 as well, even though it doesn't technically matter. Yeah, so now you can see we have our lines in here. And if we crank up the black, there you go. And so now that I'm looking at it, I think we're going to want more lines, so we're going to crank the scale back up. Just like that, something around 4 looks good. You just want to make sure you have a good variety of lines going through. And then let's go ahead and crank the whites up a little bit, just make those stronger. Maybe crank this a little bit higher so we get some good definition in between the lines. And then we will just, drag it until it looks good. It looks fine. Now the next important thing is we want to change the noise texture from 3D to 4D. And what that's going to do is that is going to give us this little W slider here, which, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it stands for, but it's essentially like combining all of these rotations, it gives us just random noise. So if I slide this, you can see it's changing, right? But there's not a standard way in which it's changing. Like if we do our X rotation, right, you can see nothing's changing, but the Y, it's rotating it on the Y axis, and the Z will rotate it on the Z axis. That's not incredibly visible just because we're working on a 2D plane, but if we were working on a 3D sphere, you would be able to see that a lot clearer. So what the W does is, we've changed it to 4D. I imagine it's just like rotating on a 4-dimensional scale. So really hard to comprehend how it's working, but that's going to be the key to that randomness. So if we go to 0, and we'll just keyframe this at 0, go to 240, keyframe this at 240, why not? Make sure to apply that. You can now see we have just some crazy lines. And this is interesting. I don't know if this slows down. I don't believe so because it's random. Okay, it does. So that's going to give us just our random lines going all over the place. Now what I like to do is I don't like how it starts really slow and then gets faster. So I'm going to select this. You can see our keyframes on here. Just right click, interpolation mode, and go linear. And so what that's going to do is basically say from point A to point B, there's no curve. It's just a straight line. So all of the animation is going to be linear. It's going to be the same speed no matter where you're at on the timeline. And for some things that's better. For some things it's worse. It just kind of depends on your project. So there we go. We have our horizontal lines. But now you say, well, that's just lines, right? Where's the noise at, right? That classic static fuzz. That's what we're going to work on with the next noise texture. So I'm going to drag the color amp closer. and we are going to start mixing in this noise texture as well. Now we don't want to use this same mapping node because this one's stretched, right? So what we're going to do is we can create a duplicate mapping node, but we can use the same texture coordinate since we're using the same object. Drop that into the vector, vector to vector, and now you can see if I just plug this in, right, we have the lines because we just duplicated it, but if we change these back, there you go. Now we have all these weird little specks everywhere. So if we bring this up to something like 20, you could see it's just random noise. It looks still choppy if you zoom in, but if you're far away, it just kind of looks like strange random noise. Change this one to 40, and you can see as we crank the W slider, there's that classic noise, just kind of fuzziness. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix these two together. So we're going to go mix color, toss that in there, plug one of them into the A and the other into B, wait for that to process. And my computer's a little bit slow right now. I don't know, it's been slowing down. There you go. Now we have our lines going, and you can see them moving, and our static is remaining still because we haven't animated the W factor yet. So we'll just go ahead and do that. Keyframe here, keyframe at the end, same rate as this one. Doesn't really matter this is the same rate, I just like working the same rate. And then again, click this, right click, interpolation mode, linear, so that we make sure it's adjusting at the same rate. And now you'll see we have some pretty good static. If you want to go in and adjust any of this, feel free to. Obviously, we could make this something more like 10, give us a more, fine vertical line, which honestly, now that I'm looking at it, I like better because it gives us less of those large clumps, which you wouldn't see a whole lot of in traditional static, at least with these horizontal lines. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and toss in some scan lines. Now again, I don't know what exactly causes the scan lines, but they are a very traditional result that you see with static. So we're going to go in here. We can use this same mapping node for the scan lines because the scan lines are also horizontal lines across the screen. And so if we plug this into the color, give it a second. All right, you can now see we have some other lines mixed in here. I'm going to duplicate this color ramp, but move the settings back to default. And I'm going to do, again, because I have Node Wrangler enabled, I can Control-Shift-Click, and we'll be working with just this noise texture so that we can see exactly how this is affecting the animation. So I'm going to crank this up. Now what we're looking for here is significantly larger lines, right? So whereas on the thin horizontal lines, we were looking for just a lot of really thin lines, avoiding the large clumps, like you see right here. What we want on this one is going to be these larger parts. So I'm going to crank the scale down until we find something like that. We have just a couple large pieces and then one small line just to add a little bit of definition in there. And then the most important part, and actually, now that I'm looking at this, I think I'm going to duplicate this mapping node instead of using the same one. That way we can just control it all locally in the mapping node. What we're going to be basically doing here is adjusting the Z location, or not the Z, my bad, the X location, so that they just slowly crawl up the screen like that. So go ahead and zero this out. Go back to frame 0, X to the end, keyframe the X here, but we're going to change it to like 24. And then, of course, just like everything else, we want to go in and make sure this one, is interesting because it's not immediately popping up with our lines, but that's not a problem. We'll just go into the graph editor, click this again. Oh, we got to make sure the plane is clicked. Right click, interpolation mode, linear, just like that. And then we can hop back to our timeline. So now you see these scan lines just slowly crawl up the screen. That I'm looking at, I think I want them to go slightly slower. So I'm just going to change this to 20. We'll see how that looks. That's not bad. Maybe 18, we'll go 3 or 2/3 the speed. Okay, that should be fine. And now, if we go ahead and mix everything together, let's see how this looks. Give it a second to update the shaders. I do need to figure that out. Recently, ever since the latest update, it's been really slow on compiling shaders, and I'm not entirely sure why. But okay, so it looks like, interesting, we actually have nothing here. So let me just make sure everything is all put together right. Well, no, that is interesting. And let's see here. Theoretically, this should be it. And so that's why you saw me click over to the other static screen. This is the original texture that I made beforehand. I was trying to identify what is different between the two. And oh, interesting. Oh, that's what it was. This was screen. So, my bad. I already forgot how to make it. Alright, so once this compiles... oh, don't crash. Okay, there we go. Let me pull this back a little bit. Swap these again so that they're correct. Then we should see the correct effect. And if we don't, I'm going to be very confused. Alright. We gotta crank this back up. So alright, so here's our lines and dots that we made before, and you can see as we bring this down, you just get those larger chunks going through, and there we go. Just like that. We'll go ahead and move this up so you can see better. There is procedural static with the moving scan lines. Just make sure when you guys are remaking this, make sure that this is set to screen, because that threw me for a loop for a second. I was a bit confused as to why it wasn't there. It wasn't working. But we got it working now. If we go to rendered, that looks really dramatic because I have this light in the scene. On the other one, I plugged the same texture into the emission, which actually looked kind of cool. That's what you would want to do if you were making like a television screen. Is you want to make sure that it was emitting light into the scene. Which I think the coolest part about that is, then you have your texture, right? But let's just say I created like a plane beneath this. I want to make sure that we're in Cyclo so that it has the ray tracing enabled. You can see you get just kind of like this flickering light, because as this is projecting the light, when it's darker, the light gets darker, and so you would get that ambient, just kind of staticky flicker in the room. Anyway, that's the tutorial. That's about all there is. The beautiful part about this is it doesn't use anything difficult in the texture coordinate. So theoretically, you could put this on any object and it should work. Let's go ahead and test it with a UV sphere. See how it wraps. Let's see which material. Material 1. Oh, that looks weird. Alright, so you can hypnotize people. That's pretty cool. Okay, so you would have to rotate it a little bit on a sphere. Maybe go with the UVs or something else. But you could wrap it around a curved screen, you could wrap it on a flat screen, put it wherever. It could be used as an overlay, which I might do a tutorial on later. I'm not excellent when it comes to doing overlays, so that's the only reason I'm hesitant. But once I figure out more about how that all works, then who knows? Maybe I'll do a tutorial for compositing and overlays as well. But yeah, that's it. Thank you everybody so much for watching, and hopefully this tutorial helps you out. If it does, feel free to comment and let me know. I would love to hear about the successes that you guys have. I would also love to see any of the projects that you do. Feel free to comment the links if you want. I think YouTube still allows putting links in other people's videos. I don't know. They might have blocked that because too many people were scamming with it. But if they do allow it, love to see what you guys do with this. And as always, subscribe if this was helpful. I make tutorials every now and then. And when I'm not making tutorials, I make other animations, other movies, random film stuff, and stuff that like. So thank you everybody so much for watching, and I will see you the next time I stream.